Hey everyone, this is Nick from NXT Plants. Today I'm going to be going over the basics of Anthurium pollination. To start off with, I want to go through the sort of basic anatomy of the inflorescence. That way we can identify what phase and whether or not we can apply pollen. So right now, this plant in front of me, it's a papilolaminum. It is currently in its receptive phase. So I'm going to try and put the inflow up to the camera and see if we can't get a peek at the stigmatic fluid. And that's what the flower secretes when it's ready to be pollinated. So when it's receptive is what we call it, and that means it's producing stigmatic fluid. So put it up to the camera. It's going to be hard to focus. But if you move it, you might be able to catch the glint in the light. And so at the end of each of these little nubbins, it'll produce the fluid. And when it's producing the fluid, we can go ahead and apply pollen. And so just to cover the technical terms, we have the spadix, which is the part here, the spathe, and then this, the stem is called the peduncle. So I got some stigmatic fluid on my finger. And then each of the nubbins, as I like to call them, on the flower are, on the inflow of the spadix are actually the flowers. So there's a bunch of, like, each little site is where a berry will develop. Just to be clear, like, flower is actually the technical term for those bumps. I believe it's called like a compound flower, the whole thing. So since I have you here, I'm going to actually go through the process of applying pollen to this inflow, show you how I do it, and sort of to begin that process, obviously I need to have collected and stored pollen. So I'm going to go through the collection process and what we do there in a bit, but to cover how we store pollen, I'm going to lift up. It's not very elegant. To preserve the pollen, inside of the Ziploc, we've got an ice pack just in case of any sort of power outage or something. Gives us a few extra hours to catch something's gone wrong so we don't lose the pollen. And then inside of the Ziploc, we have ampules with the pollen. So I'm going to take them out. I'm going to try and find one with Corbin's handwriting since it's better than mine. I don't know how well that's going to show, but in the ampule we label with the plant we collected it from and the date we collected. So this one, for example, is the Fort Sherman Self, so this plant right here, and we collected the pollen on April 24th. Now the great thing about collecting and freezing pollen is it's actually good for quite a long time, like many, many months. I know people who've used like year-old pollen and that's been kept frozen, and it's incredibly resilient. I'm working on a hybrid with a friend. It's right here. This inflow right here, and the pollen got stuck in the mail for 5 days, and we were still able to get at least a few berries out of it. So the pollen is like surprisingly resilient, even when it's like not properly being stored. That's a nice segue into a topic that I got a question about on Instagram when I asked, and that was, how do you make sure you don't have accidental cross-pollination? So a big difference between the way I grow and someone who grows in a greenhouse is there isn't really anything living in the tents. I don't have anything like fungus gnats. That can be a big accidental pollinator. I don't have anything like that. I treat to make sure. So a big thing is I just have to worry about like accidentally like catching some pollen in the wind, and the odds of that aren't too great. Yeah, the big thing is having accidental pollination by something like a fungus gnat. Something you can do to prevent it. I know a lot of people like to put fine mesh bags. It also lets the info breathe. I wouldn't recommend like sealing it. That can cause you some issues. Another benefit of using a fine mesh bag is when the time comes for berries, if you're someone unlike me who has to pick them as soon as I possibly can, the nice thing about the bag is it'll catch the berries so you won't have random seeds popping up in all of your plants. Since we're here, I'm going to demonstrate how I pollinate. I'm not actually going to keep this inflow or anything I put on it. This is purely going to be for demonstration purposes. I have something planned for its next couple inflows, so I don't want to put the burden of 3 inflows on such a small plant. You know what? I think I've decided to put queen on it just because nothing ever comes with the queen pollen, so why not waste it? Okay, so I'm going to take the ampule, pop it open, and I take these, I get a multi-pack of these brushes off Amazon. That way there's no sort of contamination issue. I can just use them and dispose of or clean them, and I have lots. Get it all covered in pollen. Now nice and loaded with pollen, and then I'm just going to go and just sort of gently brush the whole length of the flower. Now there's nothing wrong with not pollinating the full flower. If you don't, it'll just be, well, where's a good example. You can see right here I didn't pollinate the tip of this inflow. just the base, and you can see there's no issue, it's just there's no berries. That's the difference. Go finish pollinating this inflow. Let's give it another once over. If I was really trying, I'd probably apply most of this pollen. But since I'm just doing this to demonstrate, I'm just going to give it a solid once over. The great thing is they produce way more pollen than you actually need to pollinate in a single inflow. So what I often do is collect over multiple days. That way I can easily put it into a few different ones like this. And that way I can potentially apply to multiple plants, or if the plant I wanted to pollinate is receptive over multiple days, especially if it's a harder to do cross or self, I can then apply very easily without getting the moisture from this into the pollen I'm wanting to use over multiple days. The trick to keeping pollen healthy is keeping it dry. Since you saw me double dipping the brush, I would never then use this another day or on another plant. I would just be going in and applying all of the pollen that day, because I've now introduced moisture into the pollen. That's why, like I said, collect into multiple vials, and then if you're wanting to apply, you can apply a couple times, 3 times even, to the same inflow over the course of multiple days if the plant is continuing to go receptive. Okay, now let's go through sort of a few examples of different inflows at different stages of development. So once again, I'm going to pull this guy back out. Now, this is pretty interesting because I have 2 inflows here on different plants that I pollinated on almost the same day, if not the same day. Pollinated them just a few days apart. Here we've got an inflow that is just beginning to show sort of a changing in the size of the flowers. And that's a good indicator that you've successfully pollinated. It's not necessarily a guarantee that you'll actually get anything out of it. However, you're starting the process of berry development. I showed earlier much further along. And here's actually the other plant I pollinated 4 days earlier. You can see how much more development there is of berries. And that's just down to the species difference. You can see much further along in the process in terms of differentiation in size. And then here we go on this guy. Obviously we have this one down here, but I'm going to start with this one. The collaboration with my friend, Justin, putting it out there on Instagram. As you can see, this one is about a month behind this guy here. So the berries are just getting to the stage where they're going to start changing color. So when they start to go from green to red on this plant in particular, but generally most of them, when you notice a color change, it's on the fully formed berries is when you know you're going to start getting the harvest. But yeah, about a month behind and get a good eye of what they look like. Here is an inflow that's probably on its final few berries. So I've been collecting now for probably a week or so. And at this stage, you can really just easily pull them, no issue whatsoever. I'm going to pull these guys off. Probably one of the last times I'm going to be collecting from this inflow. I think it's just about giving me every berry. The yield I got off of this was super good. And so far, the seeds have been germinating really well. And it's a self-self, so those aren't always the best. I mean, I don't have any experience with them. This is my first time doing it myself. You see, even those ones are a little bit hard to work out. You can just pop them right out. But yeah, as I was saying, this is my first time doing it personally, so I'm pretty excited to see how I got a good yield. So I'll have a lot of plants to see from. And it'll be interesting to see how the self-self comes into play. It can be good for pulling out interesting traits. It's also a very healthy, vigorous plant, so its genes are good. So based off what I'm seeing from the seeds, it looks like we'll have a near 100% germination rate, which is pretty good. How do I want to demonstrate pollen collection? Because I don't have a flower that's actually producing pollen right now. So I think I'm just going to mime what I do with apply this flower here, since I don't really care about damaging it. So I got to do this from a little bit of a weird angle for me. But what I do to collect the pollen is I put the inflow down into a sheet of tin foil. Let's see if I can get this on camera. I can't see the screen of the camera, so this is going to be really fun. And then I would normally just gently brush all of the pollen off, and you want to be really careful not to damage the flowers. But just gently, 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 I brush it down into the tin foil. And once I have it in the tin foil, I take in the ampule and take the folds of the tin foil. And this part is helpful if you have a second person. And then I just brush the pollen into it. Like I said, I label it with the date and the species, and then I throw it in the freezer. That's it. Another question I got a lot was how long you should wait, or like if you can use the first inflows on a plant. I'm gonna say something a little bit controversial. I definitely do pollinate and collect pollen from first inflows. There's a caveat to that. I don't have expectations, and I only do it to pretty large, beefy, healthy plants that have a good number of leaves and a pretty robust root system and look like they could handle the stress of producing the infructescence. A good example of it is I actually pollinated this Carla's first inflow, and call me crazy, I'm also going to pollinate the second inflow, but then I won't pollinate anymore after that. And why? It's a pretty robust plant, it's a good size. This is a smaller species, so it's not disproportionate as it looks. And the big reason I pollinated this first inflow is It actually came out a really good size. You can definitely get little runty inflows. This was not the case. And also it was receptive over the course of about a week, all the way from the base to the tip. And that tells me that the plant is definitely ready for pollen. So I usually let the plant tell me whether or not it wants to be pollinated on its first inflow. This is something I probably wouldn't pollinate. It's a little small compared to, you know, another papillolaminum inflow. This wasn't the first, maybe the second inflow. Yes, sorry, it has to be the second inflow because I selfed it. So this would be the second inflow, and you can see the size difference. This is also at the end, so it has swollen quite a bit. But even from here, it's just like noticeably like at least double the length. That's probably one I wouldn't use just because it's on the smaller side. I also have plans for 2 future inflows. I don't usually put more than 2 on a plant. It doesn't mean I wouldn't. This plant held 2, no issue. It's continued to leaf and flower at essentially the same rate it did before holding any berries. It's actually working on another leaf and flower right now, and it did, again, no signs of really stress on it. It's just not as cosmetically perfect as before, but I think most of that can be blamed on sticking it in a back corner of the tent. I generally stick to 2 inflows. I'm really tempted on my Bessier Af, because that's more of an 8-month barrier, to put a 3rd inflow on it just to see if anything happens. It's holding 2 right now, but I really want to put a certain species on it, and I don't want to wait. I think I'm 4 or 6 months away from harvesting that 1 inflow off of it. So I'm debating whether or not I want to cut the 2nd inflow and put this one on it, because it's also flowering again. But it's another one that's continued to grow and flower even while holding 2 infrutescences. So I'm at a bit of a crossroads. I think I'm probably going to do it. I like to sort of test what the plants are capable of, and if something goes wrong, I can learn from it. I've taken a prop of the best, so it's not like I would even lose anything other than plant. And again, I've never had a plant die from burying, so I know that's not the case for everyone. And another question I got asked was how I know if something is compatible or not. And a lot of that comes down to just trial and error. A big one that people struggle with is the Warqueanum. I know that one specifically, it can have an odd number of B chromosomes, and you need the chromosomes to match up when you're pollinating. So that's why like generally you stay within a section. Most of them are cardiolongium, so it's pretty easy, but you can definitely do cross-sectional hybrids. And you can do some wacky hybrids. Like, I've heard of people pollinating like the Clydemoides with things from Cardio, which is just like, it's a very cross-sectional hybrid. Those things would definitely not be mixed and under natural conditions. But you can do some really weird hybrids. And I almost want to say anything's possible if you're patient. There's obviously exceptions. So many things that were believed to be sterile, turns out they're not. Things like the Queen of Hearts. Like I have friends who've made hybrids with it. People with Lux radicans I know can make hybrids with it. And both of those were believed for a long time to be sterile. So I think a big thing is just you gotta hope. Because some of them, like I said, some of them can have chromosomal anomalies. And that can allow you to make hybrids when they line up, obviously. Like I said, pretty much anything is possible, it seems, within Anthurium if you're patient and willing to just keep going. So after you harvest your seeds, you're probably going to want to know how long it takes for them to be ready and be little plants. The germination process, let me grab some germinating seeds. That's pretty neat. The germination process starts really, really fast. I started harvesting these guys only a few days ago, maybe a week, and we're already getting, let's say maybe more like 10 days. And we're already getting really good roots and the startings of leaves. There's actually some of these have leaves that are out. I'm seeing that now. If I tilt this up, I see lots of roots. And yeah, so I'm starting to get leaves, and these are the first seeds I collected from this infrutescence. And lastly, a big thing is how long it takes for them to actually make seed. Well, it's completely species dependent, and even within species, there can be a bit of a range depending on the specimen. Something like a PAP does it in about 4 months. Some of the other ones do it a little bit slower. Something like a Lux I know can take about a year, sometimes less. Same with Clarinervium. I know they have an incredibly long, I think like in excess of a year. A lot of the ones I grow, they're generally in the like 4 to 8 month range. And last things is I got a couple questions about why your Anthurium might not go receptive or might not produce pollen. And those can be 2 entirely different things. First thing for the receptive, it can be incredibly hard to see. Like I'm talking like put it right up to your eye, you might miss it. Something I recommend is holding it up to the light and looking for a bit of a shine on the ends of the flowers. And also, not all species have the sort of the very visible bumps. Some of them, it can actually be recessed. And all these things can make it even harder to see. And I look for like shininess. I try and see the moisture that way, because it can be, like I said, like nearly impossible to see. Now, as far as pollen goes, I don't have any experience with the flowers not producing pollen. I've heard it can be a lack of PK, so phosphorus and potassium. That's anecdotally what I've heard, and I believe in like the weed growing community, they use PK boosters to enhance the pollen production. Okay, I'm filming this the day after. I wanted to go through and make sure I answered everyone's questions who left one on Instagram when I asked what you guys were like wondering about when it comes to the Anthurium seedlings. I did that just to make sure I didn't miss anything, and I got so many wonderful responses. I want to take this time and go through all of them. So I got a lot of questions about the plant not being able to see the plant be receptive or the plant not going receptive, and I think a lot of it has to do with maturity, but a big one is they're not always super visible, like I was saying I think in the video yesterday. A big trick, like I said, is hold it up to the light, and I understand like it's going to be like sometimes almost impossible to see, especially if you're noticing like on like many inflows and you're still not seeing it be receptive. A plant I sort of had that experience on was both the Bessier F and the Queen. Both of them, I think it took me a few inflows in before I actually realized they were being receptive. It was just very, very minimally, but it was up the entire length of the inflow. Another question I got that I'm not sure if I answered was, how do I know when to collect pollen? And sort of what I do is once I see it reach the tip of the inflow, I'll start collecting, and I'll do that, you know, as many times as it lets me, and I feel like I'm getting a decent amount off the plant. I usually didn't do it for a few days there, and you'll get a good amount of pollen that way. I got quite a few questions about the sort of nutrition and what I do during the process when they're holding berries or producing the berries, and I just give them the feed that I talk about in the nutrient solution video. I don't do anything special for the plants when they're flowering. I just do the monthly reservoir changes. That's about it. Like I said, there's no sort of extra care or fertilization that goes into the process when they're making berries. It's just the same that I do for all of my plants that are getting the full strength nutrient solution. I got some questions about temperature, sort of the role that plays. Plants in general will grow faster at higher temperatures. The big one I noticed is the seeds germinate and they spread a lot faster if they're on heat mats. And I think the heat mats hold about 25 degrees Celsius. And if you're noticing your plant isn't flowering and it's at caterpillar, not all species will flower right away when they hit caterpillar. Some ones I've noticed in particular, in my experience, again, the queens don't do it right away. Some of the pendant species like the Winlingri or Pallitiflorum, they don't always do it right away. I've noticed my Wonder Boy, it might just be mine, but it's now, I think, on its third caterpillar leaf, and it has still yet to flower. Like same thing, like the Ace of Spades I know is a little bit harder to get to flower. I think these are all species that just need to be a little bit more mature before they'll flower. I don't know if there's anything you can do to necessarily speed that up. They're getting the same fertilizer. They seem pretty happy otherwise. I think they just hit caterpillar at a little bit of a smaller size compared to when they're going to naturally flower. And one of the advantages about growing Anthurium is there isn't really any sort of season. They are happy to flower and grow year round, so you can definitely hybridize with them year round. I keep them in a pretty controlled environment, so there isn't really worries about temperatures getting too hot or too cold. And if they're happy, like they are good to be pollinated and produce flowers year round. There isn't really a seasonality to them. Lastly, I got a question about how I clean the seeds. It's super simple. So when you get a berry off the plant, you can really just like pop out the seed. I'm gonna do it for the camera. And you'll see like a little seed popped out. I recommend doing this on paper towel. See it right on my thumb there. Pop it out on paper towel, and the seed will have also a clear sort of shell to it, and you just want to make sure that bit's off. You can give it a rinse in water. I don't always do that. And then I'd be good to just slap this on your germination medium of choice. I use tree fern mixed with pumice and perlite. I know a lot of people like to do stratum or perlite, like you can really do whatever, moss even. You just pop the seed out, get the shell that is around it. It's clear, so sometimes you miss them. I don't even always make sure they're all removed, but it's good too, because that can cause it to rot. Yeah, and then throw it on your germination medium of choice. What are my hybridization goals? I think my goals whenever I'm creating a hybrid is to try to make a plant that's better than either parent in a specific way. So whether that's breeding, you know, for minimally veined or maximally veined, maybe it's narrowness or a nice dark color or whatever it is you're breeding for. I'm breeding towards trying to improve a specific trait, and that's usually why I will make a cross. And then I think whenever you're making these crosses, it's really important to make sure you're going through and pretty aggressively culling. So like if you're in Canada, I think that there's definitely going to come a time when I'll start selling my seedlings and also divisions of my plant. I do a little bit, especially locally, but once I have more of these hybrids, I would love to be able to share them with everyone. So like definitely if you're looking for that, I think that'll most likely take place over on Instagram, where I'll do announcements there. I want to keep the YouTube more on the educational side rather than the selling. But yeah, obviously like when you make hybrids, you're gonna have quite a few plants, and I can't grow dozens and dozens and dozens of every hybrid I make. I'd quickly be drowning in a sea of plants. I mean, it'd be a happy way to go, but I like to have a little bit of diversity. And one thing I forgot to mention, whenever I make a hybrid, I'm always make sure to label what pollen I used and the date I applied it. You can see an example of that here. Just put, like I said, the name of the plant the pollen's coming from and then the date I did it. And that's really nice because when you go to harvest, you can see exactly how long it took from when you applied the pollen to your first berry harvest. And it's good for planning out hybrids in the future, because when you have the plant berrying, you sort of lose options on what hybrids you could make with it, because it's going to temporarily be unable to be hybridized more than, one maybe other time. This one was pretty fun because I think I harvested it 4 months to the day exactly, which if I wasn't documenting that, I never would have known. And it's good just for personal record keeping to get to learn all this information about them, because I feel like whenever I look this up, there's very little information that's easily searchable. If you ask, you can pretty quickly find, I don't know if gestation's the right term, but the gestation period for them, especially in the Anthurium groups. There's so many really good growers out there who've been doing this a long time, and they have so much knowledge in their heads, and they're really good if you just ask questions. I think that covers all the questions I got. Thank you guys so much for sending those in. It's really helpful. I always forget what I know and it's always helpful to get questions to sort of direct the conversation. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you were able to learn something from the video and feel a little bit more confident going into potentially making your own hybrids at home. Have a good one.